The world outside my window, a tapestry of muted grays and the ceaseless sigh of the urban sprawl, rarely intruded upon my sanctuary. Here, within these walls, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and the faint, metallic tang of ink. My life, meticulously ordered as the lines on a forgotten chart, unfolded in the quiet ritual of discovery. I, Cole, found my solace not in the present, but in the echoes of distant pasts, tracing the phantom shorelines of empires long dissolved, the rivers that once carved different paths, the mountains whose names have since been lost to the eroding breath of time. My fingers, stained perpetually with sepia and graphite, moved with the practiced reverence of a scholar unearthing sacred texts. Each map, whether a parchment fragment barely clinging to its own existence or a robust vellum sheet bearing the confident strokes of a Renaissance hand, was a puzzle, a whisper from an earlier consciousness. My days were spent in communion with these silent witnesses, their delicate surfaces spread across the vast oak table that dominated my study, illuminated by the focused glow of a single brass lamp. The current object of my devotion was a particularly enigmatic piece, salvaged from the archives of a defunct maritime guild. It was a formidable thing, almost a meter square, yet frustratingly incomplete. Its edges were frayed like ancient linen, a testament to centuries of unfolding and refolding. The parchment itself, brittle and stained, bore the mottled patina of sea salt and time. Its geographical scope was vast, depicting a stretch of ocean that, even to my seasoned eye, seemed to defy precise identification. There were familiar contours, the rugged coast of a known continent, the familiar cluster of an archipelago, but they were rendered with an unsettling distortion, as if viewed through warped glass. For weeks, I had pored over its intricate details, cross-referencing its archaic symbols with countless other charts, navigational logs, and historical accounts. The script, a crabbed hand I had eventually deciphered as a regional dialect from the late 16th century, offered tantalizing, often contradictory, clues. I charted its currents, measured its scale against known constellations, and even attempted to reconstruct the likely worldview of its anonymous cartographer. It was a painstaking, solitary endeavor, the kind that both demanded and consumed every fiber of my being. Then, it appeared. It was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, insidious creeping into my awareness, like a shadow lengthening imperceptibly until it swallows the light. At first, I dismissed it as an aberration, a smudge, perhaps a water stain that had dried in an unfortunate configuration. It lay nestled in a vast, empty expanse of ocean, far from any established trade routes or known landmasses. A small, roughly oval shape, devoid of the intricate topographical lines or decorative flourishes that adorned the rest of the map's islands. It was simply there. A blank space within a meticulously detailed world. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the ancient surface for a moment. My magnifying glass, an instrument of truth, hovered above the anomaly. Under its crystal gaze, the shape did not resolve into a familiar pattern of decay or damage. Instead, it sharpened, its edges defined with an unnatural precision, a stark contrast to the faded, imprecise outlines of its neighbors. It was not a stain. It was a mark. My initial reaction was a surge of professional indignation. A mistake. An oversight by the original cartographer, perhaps a patch of land rumored but never verified, hastily added and then forgotten. I consulted my extensive library, pulling down atlases, globes, and even obscure maritime journals. I cross-referenced coordinates, checked for any historical mention of an island in that approximate location. Nothing. The more I searched, the more the blank oval asserted itself, mocking my meticulous research. It was not merely unmapped, it was impossible. Its position, according to the fated celestial markers on the chart, placed it in waters that were consistently, demonstrably empty across every other known document from that era, and indeed, from every era since. A prickle of unease began to trace its way up my spine. My rational mind, a fortress built on empirical data and verifiable facts, rebelled. I sought flaws in my own perception. I shifted the map, viewed it from different angles, held it up to varying light sources. The island persisted, a stubborn, silent accusation. As I stared, my eyes tracing its alien contours, a subtle shift occurred. It was not a physical alteration of the parchment, but something deeper, within my own sight. The faint, almost imperceptible lines that formed its boundaries seemed to waver, to breathe, as if the landmass itself was not fixed but in a state of perpetual, glacial flux. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, a symptom of tired eyes. Yet, the sensation lingered, a phantom current running beneath my skin. The air in my study, usually a comforting embrace of familiar scents, seemed to grow heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. The brass lamp's glow, usually so steady, flickered once, though no draft stirred the quiet room. And then, without warning, a sensation, sharp and disorienting, pierced through my concentration. I was no longer in my study. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I stood upon an ocean shore at night with stationary waves. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin, tasting of salt and something else, something ancient and metallic, like rusted iron. The sky above was a bruised indigo, devoid of stars, and the vast expanse of water before me stretched into an infinite blackness. The waves, however, were the most unsettling. They were not crashing, not rolling, not even gently lapping. They were frozen in mid-crest, colossal peaks of dark water held in an impossible suspension, their foamy white caps caught in a silent scream. A profound, unnatural stillness enveloped everything, a suffocating vacuum of sound and motion. Then, just as suddenly, the vision dissolved. I gasped, my hand flying to my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was back in my study, the familiar scent of old paper filling my nostrils, the reassuring weight of the ancient chart beneath my fingertips. The brass lamp burned steadily. No draft. My gaze snapped back to the map, to the impossible island. The brief, terrifying intrusion had left me shaken, but it had also solidified something within me. This was no mere cartographical error. This was something else entirely. Something alive. Something that had reached out from the depths of a forgotten past and touched my reality. The rational part of me screamed for caution, for dismissal, for a return to the safe, verifiable world of established facts. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to find it. The impossible island called to me, a silent siren song from the depths of an uncharted ocean, promising a discovery that would either redefine the world or utterly shatter my own. The impossible island, a phantom etched in brittle parchment, had become the sole geography of my mind. The world beyond my window, a muted canvas of city grays, receded further still, its ceaseless sigh now a mere whisper against the roar of my burgeoning fixation. My sanctuary, once a haven of meticulous order, transformed into a maelstrom of research. Books, their spines cracked with age, lay open like splayed birds. Maps, some too delicate to unroll fully, cascaded from shelves. The dust, once a minor nuisance, now seemed a vital component of the atmosphere, a fine, almost sacred powder stirred by my frantic movements. Sleep became a grudging necessity, dreams a turbulent landscape where the sea roiled under an unblinking eye, and the island, impossibly green, shimmered on the horizon. Days bled into weeks. My fingers, stained with the ghostly pigment of forgotten charts, traced lines of longitude and latitude across countless documents, seeking any whisper, any aberrant notation that might corroborate the impossible. My gaze, sharpened by relentless focus, scanned microfiches until the world blurred into a static haze. Tucked within a ledger detailing cargo manifests from the late 17th century, almost hidden by a mildewed fold, was a single, brittle sheet of paper. Its edges were frayed like old lace, the ink faded to a sepia ghost. It was a fragment, crudely torn from what I recognized as a sailor's personal journal. The script, cramped and hurried, spoke of a voyage gone awry, of compasses spinning wildly. with an unsettling, almost organic fluidity. The island was not just an anomaly, it was an enigma that demanded to be understood. I corresponded with obscure coastal museums, pursued leads in forgotten fishing villages, and devoured ethnographic texts detailing the superstitions of ancient seafaring communities. It was in a collection of transcribed tales from a remote fishing community, dating back centuries, that I found the second corroboration. The stories described a pervasive stillness, an unnatural quiet that preceded its arrival, and a profound sense of disorientation that followed its departure. They spoke of an island that was not merely geographical, but ontological. The impossible island was real. And it was waiting. My life, once defined by the quiet precision of my craft, became a relentless engine of preparation. I liquidated assets, sold off cherished antique maps, and channeled every fiber of my being into the logistics of an expedition. Route planning consumed me, each line drawn a commitment, each calculation a step closer to the unknown. I meticulously sourced provisions, navigation equipment, and communication gear, every item chosen with an almost religious fervor. The scale of the undertaking was immense, the financial strain considerable, yet the thought of turning back was anathema. The island had become an unshakable imperative, a siren song echoing in the chambers of my skull. Assembling a crew proved to be a delicate dance. Most dismissed my claims as the ravings of an eccentric academic, the impossible chart a mere fabrication. Yet, a few, drawn by the promise of considerable pay, or perhaps by a flicker of their own suppressed wanderlust, agreed to join. There was the seasoned helmsman, a man whose eyes held the weary wisdom of countless storms, his skepticism a shield I knew I would have to work hard to penetrate. There was the quiet engineer, his hands calloused from years of coaxing life from stubborn engines, his interest purely in the mechanical challenge. I offered them no grand pronouncements of discovery, only the lure of uncharted waters and a generous purse, carefully omitting the more unsettling details of the journal fragment and the folklore. They were skeptical, yes, but willing to sail. One night, the expedition plans meticulously laid out, the funding secured, and the crew roster complete, I found myself drawn from the suffocating confines of my study. The city, usually a barrier against the wild, now felt like a cage. The moon, a sliver of bone, cast a weak, silver sheen across the placid surface. They did not break with their usual vigor, but instead rolled in, flat and unbroken, as if the very energy of the sea had been leached away. It was an unnerving stillness, a mirror to the unnatural calm described in the old tales. Yet, I knew it lied. Out there, somewhere beyond the reach of conventional maps, beyond the understanding of science, awaited a place that defied all logic. A place that consumed memory, twisted perception. I had opened a door, and now, I was compelled to step through. The journey had begun. The trawler, a vessel of grim purpose now, cut a determined furrow through the indifferent indigo. Days bled into weeks, each horizon a mirror of the last, reflecting only the vast, indifferent expanse. My skin grew rough with sun and salt, my eyes perpetually narrowed against the glare, yet my resolve remained a granite core within me. The island, an impossible whisper on an ancient fragment, pulled me eastward, a lodestone. Embedded in my very core. The journey was a crucible. The ocean, usually a chaotic symphony of motion, began to hum a discordant, subtle note. First, the compass. Its needle, once a faithful sentinel pointing north, developed a tremor, a hesitant shiver that would occasionally blossom into a frantic, uncontrolled spin. Then the GPS, a modern marvel, began to fail. Its screen would pixelate, then dissolve into a snowy static, the coordinates of our position replaced by meaningless gibberish, a language of fractured light. We were navigating by dead reckoning, by instinct, by a faith in the invisible pull of the unmapped. Sleep offered no respite. My nights were not dreams, but rather a slow, creeping invasion. I would lie in my bunk, the rhythmic creak of the hollow lullaby that soured into a dirge, and feel watched. not by eyes, but by a vast, formless attention. My dreams were not visions of the island, but of perception itself fraying. Maps would unspool before me, their lines blurring, their contours dissolving into an inky void. A pervasive unease settled over the trawler like a shroud. The usual banter of the crew, the rough jokes and easy camaraderie, dwindled to terse commands and the low, constant thrum of the engine. The cook, a man usually buoyant with robust humor, began to move with a hesitant, almost furtive grace, his eyes darting towards the endless horizon as if expecting something to erupt from its placid surface. The deckhand, a young man whose boundless energy had once been infectious, now spent his watches staring out at the waves, his face slack with an unsettling vacancy. I felt it too, a constant prickle on the nape of my neck, the sensation of being perpetually on the verge of remembering something crucial, something terrible, that always slipped just beyond my grasp. Then, one morning, it was there. Not a clear silhouette against the dawn, but a smudge, a bruise on the horizon that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. As we drew closer, the smudge resolved into something that defied resolution. A wall of mist, thick and unnatural, rose from the water, swallowing the island whole. It was not the familiar sea fog, which swirled and danced, revealing glimpses of the world beyond. This mist was static, a solid, gray curtain, unmoving, unyielding. It seemed to shimmer at the edges of my perception, a visual distortion, as if the very air around it was vibrating with an unheard frequency. The trawler, now a fragile toy against the looming mystery, slowed to a crawl. The silence was profound. The usual chorus of gulls was absent. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath, its waves barely lapping against the hull. Yet, before us lay only the impenetrable mist, a gray blankness that seemed to mock the very concept of cartography. This was not merely an unmapped place, it was a place that resisted being known. I ordered the skiff lowered. A small team, myself included, would make the initial approach. The deckhand, his eyes now wide and vacant, moved with a sluggishness that unnerved me. The helmsman merely nodded, his gaze fixed on the shimmering veil, a silent plea in his eyes that I ignored. The mist swallowed us whole, a clammy embrace that stole the light and muffled all sound. My breath plumed before me, a ghost of my own apprehension. The air grew heavy, thick with an earthy, damp smell, yet utterly devoid of the usual coastal aroma of brine and decay. We had arrived. It was a sight that clawed at the foundations of my understanding. The water before me was not moving. They were silent, unmoving monuments to a physics that did not exist. I shone my lantern around, its beams swallowed by the swirling gray. There were no trees, no rocks, no discernible features. The ground sloped gently upwards into the mist, a smooth, featureless expanse that seemed to absorb the light, refusing to yield any detail. He shook his head, his eyes wide and unfocused, his gaze sweeping the formless landscape. Nothing, Cole. Just this. Just this. An island that was not truly there, a shore of frozen waves, a world without form or feature. My cartographer's mind, so accustomed to the comforting certainties of lines and contours, reeled. This was not merely unmapped, it was unmappable. The first days were a slow unraveling. My initial exhilaration, that fierce, almost possessive joy of discovery, began to curdle into something colder, something less definable. The island, a place I had so desperately sought to chart, resisted my every attempt to impose order upon it. My instruments, usually faithful extensions of my will, seemed to falter. The sextant's readings danced with an impossible capriciousness, the compass needle, rather than settling north, often trembled, then spun in lazy, aimless circles before jerking to an arbitrary point. Another one, Cole, the supply master grumbled, holding up a coil of rope. Its middle section frayed as if by acid. This was new stock, sealed. And a pickaxe from the excavation kit is gone. Just gone. I dismissed it, of course. Salt air, perhaps, and human error. We're all tired. But the words felt thin, even to my own ears. A missing axe could be misplaced, but a rope rotting from the inside out in a dry storage tent? My meticulous nature bristled. Then came the shifts. Subtle at first, like a trick of the light, or a memory playing false. A cluster of gnarled, wind-beaten shrubs I had noted as a marker on my preliminary sketch, seemed to have migrated a dozen paces to the west. I walked the ground, tracing the path, convincing myself I had simply misremembered its exact location. The next morning, a small, distinctive outcropping of rock, shaped like a sleeping beast, which I had carefully sketched into my field notes, was utterly absent. In its place, a smooth, featureless rise of earth, as if the land itself had swallowed the stone. My cartographer's mind, a fortress built of precision and verifiable fact, began to feel the first tremors of an internal siege. I spent hours, compass in hand, pacing the same stretches of shore, comparing my observations to the previous day's entries. The lines on my sketches, once firm and reassuring, now seemed to waver, mocking me. Was I losing my grip? Was the strain of the expedition, the sheer impossibility of what we had found, finally eroding my faculties? The crew, too, felt the creeping malaise. Whispers began to circulate, hushed and nervous, around the evening fire. The cook swore his rations were shrinking, not just eaten, but less when he went to prepare them. The engineer reported strange, faint humming noises from the core of the island at night, a sound that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but through the very earth beneath our feet. We were a small group, isolated and vulnerable, and the fabric of our shared reality began to fray. "We need to know what's beyond that ridge," I instructed the lead scout, pointing to a distant, hazy elevation. "A quick reconnaissance, nothing more. Take the junior scout, be back by dusk." They departed with the morning's pale light, two figures against the vast, indifferent landscape. I watched them go, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening in my gut, but this time it was different. Dusk arrived, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. One figure emerged from the distant haze, stumbling, then running. He just vanished. We were walking, side by side. I turned to point out a landmark, and when I looked back, he wasn't there. No sound. No struggle. Gone. A terrible silence descended upon the camp, heavier and colder than the night air. No one spoke. The fire crackled, its flames suddenly seeming too small, too weak against the encroaching vastness. Panic, a feral, clawing thing, began its slow ascent. "What do you mean, gone?" the engineer demanded, his voice cracking, his eyes darting wildly between me and the scout. "Did he fall? Did you look for tracks?" The scout shook his head, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. There was nothing. The ground was just smooth. Like he was never there. Accusations, sharp and desperate, erupted then, a cacophony of fear and blame. The supply master, his face pale and drawn, rounded on the scout. "You were responsible. How could you lose him? What did you do?" I stood amidst the rising tide of hysteria, my own mind struggling to grasp the ungraspable. A man, a living, breathing member of my crew, simply ceasing to be. It defied every law of physics, every principle of existence I knew. This was not a misplaced rope, or a shifting rock. This was an annihilation. Later, long after I had managed to quell the immediate outburst, forcing the crew into a semblance of order, I walked to the edge of our camp. The night had fully claimed the land, swallowing all but the faintest outlines of the distant ridges. I could hear the hushed, fearful conversations from the tents, the occasional sob. The waves, frozen in mid-crest, seemed to mock me with their impossible permanence. My cartographer's instinct, once a source of strength,
was now a torment. How could I map a place that erased itself? How could I understand an island that simply took the Anna Hill?
The thought withered on my tongue, a fragile blossom of language in the face of such an impossible blight. A man, a robust and laughing soul just hours past, was gone. Not fallen, not lost, not even dead, for death leaves a trace, a memory, a body. This was an eradication, a severing from the very fabric of existence, leaving behind only the ghost of his absence and the shocked eyes of the remaining crew. Panic, a raw, animal thing, began to claw at the edges of their composure. Whispers turned to shouts, shouts to accusations, as each man sought to anchor himself to a reality that was visibly fraying. I watched them, their faces stark in the flickering lamplight, their fear a palpable scent in the humid air. My own mind, a cartographer's instrument designed for precision and order, felt suddenly warped, its fine calibrations thrown into disarray. What map could account for a void where a man had been? The crew had retreated into a huddle of tents, their voices hushed, their movements wary. I needed air, space, a horizon that did not feel like a wall closing in. The water, usually a restless churn, lay oddly still, barely sighing against the land. The waves, though present, seemed frozen in their approach, a photographic tableau of perpetual motion caught in an eternal pause. It was unsettling, this unnatural calm, as if the very sea held its breath, witnessing something it dared not name. I shook my head, a sharp, physical motion meant to dislodge the creeping fog. It was fatigue, I told myself, the strain of these bewildering days. But the fog persisted. The next morning brought no solace. The quartermaster, a man of meticulous habits and unshakable calm, was discovered wandering near the makeshift camp, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but the words were a jumble of syllables, a linguistic debris field. The. Deep. Where? Maps. No, blue, he stammered, his gaze drifting over the faces of his shipmates without recognition. He did not know the navigator, who had shared a cabin with him for years. The sight of him, a living ghost, was more terrifying than the outright disappearance. The deckhand was gone, annihilated. The quartermaster was here, but annihilated in a far more insidious way. This place did not merely consume bodies, it consumed the very essence of being. It fed on perception, on experience, on the delicate, interwoven strands of memory that construct identity. The island was not just taking lives, it was erasing them, leaving no trace, not even in the minds of those who remained. A sudden, sharp tremor ran through me. I reached for my compass, a familiar, solid weight at my hip. But had I put it there? A flicker of doubt, brief but unsettling, danced at the edge of my consciousness. I tried to recall the precise moment I had last used it, last strapped it to my belt. The memory felt like trying to grasp smoke. It was there, and then it wasn't, a blank space where a clear image should have been. How long had I been standing by the quartermaster? What had I been doing before that? Small pockets of time, once clearly defined, now felt hazy, indistinct. I walked away from the stunned crew, needing distance, needing to think. The air, once merely humid, now felt thick, viscous, as if it resisted my every movement. The trees, which I had mapped meticulously upon our arrival, seemed to have shifted, their canopy denser, their trunks slightly more gnarled than I remembered. Or was it merely my perception? The thought itself was a poison, seeping into the foundations of my reality. I ran a hand over my brow, a desperate attempt to clear the fog. What was the name of the star I used for navigation on the night we first sighted this island? I knew it. I should know it. But the name, the image, the precise celestial coordinates, eluded me, a fish slipping through my fingers. The island was not just taking them. It was taking me. Piece by agonizing piece. It was peeling away the layers of who I was, leaving me adrift in a sea of forgotten moments. I was a cartographer, a man who defined the world through lines and labels, and this island was systematically obliterating my very ability to define myself.
The Hill.
This was an eradication, a severing from existence itself. I clutched a sheaf of papers, their edges damp and softened by the pervasive humidity that clung to everything now. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from a tremor that had begun deep in my bones days ago and seemed to be working its way outward, dissolving my very coherence. I was in the small, cramped cabin, surrounded by the remnants of our expedition, charts unfurled like flateskin, compasses spinning in slow, aimless circles, instruments coated in a fine, rust-colored dust that wasn't rust at all.
It was something else, something alive and patiently consuming. The logs.
I forced my eyes to the captain's last entry, scrawled with a heavy, uncertain hand. The shoreline shifts.
Not with tide, but with thought. Saw the cook, walking into the trees.
He turned, smiled. Said, no need for sustenance where there is only
remembrance.
The words blurred.
Remembrance of what? Of whom?
I could almost hear the island's slow, deliberate intake of breath, drawing in the essence of us. Another log, this one from the first mate, discovered tucked beneath a loose floorboard, the sound.
Not wind, not water. A hum. It's like the earth is trying to conceptualize itself through us. Every measurement, every line drawn, it feels like an offering. An offering.
The word echoed in the silence, a chilling revelation.
The island didn't just exist, it was.
And our attempts to define it, to map its contours, to name its features, these were not acts of discovery, but acts of sustenance.
It fed on perception, on the very act of knowing.
The more we understood it, the more it absorbed us. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and something metallic, like old blood, though I saw none. The bulkheads groaned, a sound that wasn't merely the ship settling in the swell, but a deeper, more organic complaint. The wood, once sturdy oak, now felt spongy to the touch, and trails of a luminous, phosphorescent moss snaked across the deck planks, pulsing faintly. The ship, too, was succumbing. Its very structure was losing its integrity, its purpose. I stumbled out onto the deck, needing air, needing to confirm that the sky still held stars, that the ocean was still vast and indifferent. The sea, however, was wrong. I walked to the railing, leaning heavily against the corroded metal, and stared. They stretched before me, arrested in their perpetual motion, frozen mid-crest, mid-trough. A vast, impossible tableau of halted energy. The moonlight, fractured and diffused by the humid air, painted the immobile water in shades of silver and obsidian. No ebb, no flow, just an eternal, silent pause. It was here, gazing at that impossible stillness, that the full horror solidified within me. The island was not merely consuming our bodies or our sanity, it was consuming our knowledge of it. Our maps, our observations, our very memories of its existence were its nourishment. Every line I had ever drawn, every coordinate I had plotted, every detail I had committed to my mind, each was a morsel. The captain, the first mate, the cook, the others. They had not simply vanished. They had been unmade. Their perception, their identity, their very being, absorbed. A desperate, terrifying truth bloomed in the wasteland of my mind. If knowing it was what fed it, then the only escape, the only way to survive, was to unknow it. To forget. To erase its existence from my consciousness, to dismantle the intricate mental edifice I had so painstakingly built. For a cartographer, whose life was a testament to meticulous recall and precise definition, this was a death sentence of the spirit. It was an act of profound self-betrayal, a tearing away of the very fabric of my identity. I tried to recall the face of the colleague who had first shown me the fragmented chart, the ancient, impossible map that had drawn me here.
A blur. The details refused to coalesce. My own memories were already fading, dissolving like sugar in tea.
I closed my eyes, picturing my study, the familiar scent of aged paper and ink.
The image flickered, a transient ghost.
The walls of my home, the pattern of the rug, the specific tilt of my favorite armchair, they were all becoming indistinct, sneered. The ship groaned again, a deeper, more resonant sound, like the last breath of a dying leviathan. The stationary waves before me seemed to hum, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck, up through my feet, into my very skull.
It wasn't just my memories that were slipping.
The vessel itself, the last physical tether to the world I knew, was failing. The compass in the binnacle spun wildly, then stopped, pointing not north, but at some indeterminate point within the island itself.
I was one of the last.
A solitary, dissolving mind on a dying ship, facing an entity that devoured consciousness.
But the alternative?
The alternative was to become another unmade, another silent echo in the island's vast, hungry awareness.
The choice, stark and horrifying, lay before me. To forget, or to be forgotten entirely.
The air hung thick with salt and the metallic tang of something ancient, something that had seeped from the very rock of this impossible land.
My breath hitched in my throat, each inhalation a shallow, desperate gulp.
The wind, when it stirred, carried whispers that were not wind at all, but echoes of voices I knew, voices I had meticulously recorded in my journals, now twisted into a discordant chorus. I stood amidst the scattered detritus of my life's work, a madman at the edge of the world. The last of my expedition crates lay open, disgorging its contents onto the sand. Maps, meticulously drafted with India ink in fine nibs, fluttered like wounded birds. My journals, filled with observations, compass bearings, and the precise measurements that had once been my pride, lay scattered like fallen leaves. Each document represented a thread, a connection to this place, a piece of my mind the island sought to devour. An offering, the word returned, a cold blade scraping against the inside of my skull. It was not enough to merely exist here, I had offered it my very being, my identity as a cartographer, a man who saw the world in lines and coordinates. And it had accepted. My hands, trembling but resolute, reached for the nearest map. It was the master chart, the culmination of weeks of surveying, the one that detailed the island's impossible, shifting contours.
The ink seemed to shimmer, the lines breathing with a faint, internal light.
I could feel its pull, a subtle magnetism drawing my gaze, inviting me to lose myself in its deceptive precision. My fingers closed around the heavy parchment, tearing it with a savage, ripping sound that echoed too loudly in the profound quiet. He pointed a skeletal finger at the torn map.
You destroy our legacy, Cole? Our discovery?
His voice, a dry rustle of papyrus, was not heard by my ears, but felt directly in the marrow of my bones.
I ignored him, my gaze fixed on the task. Another map, one detailing the island's internal topography, followed the first.
I ripped it into smaller and smaller pieces, the delicate paper yielding with a satisfying, yet agonizing, surrender. I was a man of order, of definition, and I was systematically dismantling my own world. The second mate materialized beside the first, a silent, gaunt sentinel.
You abandon us.
The island was not just showing me phantoms, it was twisting the knife, using my own memories, my own affections, against me. It wanted me to remember them, to remember the glory of the impossible island, to remember my identity as its discoverer. That memory, that identity, was the meal it craved.
My journals were next.
These were harder.
I opened the first, my own elegant script staring back at me. Day 1, uncharted landmass verified. Coordinates.
My hand shook, but I forced it to tear. The thick paper resisted, a stubborn refusal, but I prevailed, the pages scattering like ashes in the phantom breeze. More figures emerged from the periphery, spectral crewmen, their faces a tapestry of despair and betrayal. They surrounded me, their silent accusations a deafening roar in my mind. The cook, the deckhand, the junior cartographer, all of them, the living ghosts of my obsession. I fought against the suffocating presence, the insidious tendrils of memory and identity it sought to weave around me. This was the final stand. If I allowed myself to remember, to truly feel the loss, to acknowledge the island's reality, I would be lost. I grabbed a heavy, brass-bound logbook, its leather cover worn smooth by years of maritime use. This was the most dangerous artifact, a chronicle of our entire journey, the very first sighting of the impossible land. It manifested a vision, vivid and sharp, myself, standing on the deck of our vessel, telescope raised, my face alight with the thrill of discovery. The sun glinted off the distant, emerald peak. The memory was intoxicating, pulling me back to that moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. But I forced my eyes away, focusing on the rough texture of the leather. I raised the book high, then brought it down with all my might against a jagged piece of coral protruding from the sand. Once. Twice. The spine cracked, the leather split, and the pages, waterlogged from the journey, splayed open, tearing away from their binding. I continued, a frenzy taking hold, smashing it again and again until it was a pulpy, unrecognizable mess. My cartographic identity, my meticulous nature, my very self was being torn asunder with each destructive act. It was a self-immolation of the mind, a desperate attempt to unknow, to unsee, to unbe. Don't forget us, Cole. Don't forget what we found. But I had asterisk to forget. The island fed on knowledge, on definition, on the very act of being perceived. My hands, bloodied from the sharp edges of the paper and the coral, tore at the last remnants. I clawed at the sand, burying the fragments, trying to erase their very existence from the world, and from my mind. The stationary waves continued their slow, rhythmic sighs against the sand, an indifferent witness to my desperate, final act of amnesia. Only then, perhaps, could I escape. Only then could I cease to be its offering. My hands, bloodied from the sharp edges of. I remember only the frantic tearing, the desperate ripping of paper, the furious scraping of ink from parchment. A primal scream, not of pain, but of a profound, shattering urgency, had clawed its way out of my throat, echoing not in the air but in the hollow space between my ears. And then, a blessed, terrible blankness. The next sensation was the cold, damp grit beneath my cheek. My eyes, thick with crust, peeled open to the gray smear of dawn. The waves, indeed, did not move. Or rather, they moved with an impossible slowness, a viscous, heavy sigh against the sand, as if the very ocean itself was struggling to breathe. The air tasted of salt and something else, something metallic and old, like forgotten iron. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a physical manifestation of the emptiness behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, my limbs stiff, heavy, as though I had been buried in the sand for a century. Around me, the remnants of my expedition lay scattered. A broken compass, its needle snapped. A sextant, its brass tarnished, its mirrors shattered. And fragments of paper, damp and indecipherable, clinging to the wet sand. I felt no curiosity towards them, only a vague, unsettling aversion, like looking at something irrevocably tainted. I had no recollection of how I came to be here, alone, amidst the debris of a forgotten purpose. A small vessel, a launch from a larger ship, lay half-submerged nearby, its hull stove in. I simply knew, with a certainty that bypassed memory, that I had to leave this place. The journey back was a blur of sun-drenched haze and bone-deep weariness. I recall the rocking of a larger ship, the distant drone of its engines, the faces of the crew, indistinct and shifting, their questions muffled, meaningless. They spoke of a storm, a rogue wave, a miracle that I had been found. I nodded, mumbled, offered no details, for there were none to give. Back in my city, the familiar streets felt alien, their geometry skewed, their colors too vivid or too muted. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, each particle a tiny, accusing eye. My desk, once meticulously organized, was covered in a thin film of neglect. The tools of my trade, inkwells, quills, compasses, protractors, lay exactly where I had left them. But they no longer called to me. The maps. Oh, the maps. Stacked neatly in their wooden drawers, rolled in their canvas tubes, pinned to the corkboard that dominated one wall. They were my life's work, my passion, the very language of my being. The precise lines, the elegant curves of coastlines, the meticulous shading of mountain ranges, the delicate script of place names, each detail was a tiny barb, threatening to pierce the fragile membrane of my amnesia. I could not touch them. I could not look at them for long. A shiver would course through me, a nameless premonition of something unspeakable. Sometimes, in the dead of night, a fragment of a sensation would surface. Or a scent, a mix of damp earth and decaying vegetation, sharp and cloying. I exist now in a state of perpetual vigilance, a sentry guarding a forgotten prison. The world feels subtly wrong, a vast, elaborate deception designed to lull me into complacency. I avoid the docks, the ships, the scent of the sea. I avoid conversations that stray too far into geography, into exploration, into the unknown. The island, that impossible, unmapped entity, remains unseen, unrecorded, a silent predator lurking beyond the edges of human perception. The island lives on, consuming not just memory, but identity itself. And I, Cole, the cartographer, am its living proof.